If you drag an object from the Data Sources window onto a window in WPF, Visual Studio creates a data grid for you. And the nice thing about drag and drop data binding is that Visual Studio writes some XAML for you, and it creates a collection view source for you. And one of the nice things about the collection view source is that one-to-many relationships are handled automatically. And then by default, all of the columns are included in the grid, and they're sized to the column headers, so you'll have to adjust those. But drag and drop data binding is a nice way to get Visual Studio to write some XAML for you, particularly the collection view source. So the benefit of the collection view source is not only that it handles one-to-many relationships, but it's also the way you group and sort and filter. So to group, you use the group descriptions property of the collection view. And the collection view is the view based on the underlying collection, whether it's customers, orders, order details, what have you. You can style the data grid to control the appearance of groups. And to sort, you use the sort descriptions property of the collection view. And as you know by now, the sort descriptions property contains sort description structures that specify the column to sort on and the order. And you should always sort first before you group, or a runtime exception occurs. You can't group on country if the underlying customers are not ordered by country. You can also filter in a data grid, and there are two techniques. In the first technique, you're going to base your collection view on an instance of the list collection view class, and then you set the filter property of the collection view to a callback method. And that callback method will evaluate each item in the collection and then determine whether or not it should be included in the view. And then you can set it to nothing or null, depending on your language, to clear the filter. In technique 2, you can base your collection view on a binding list collection view. And the binding list collection view class has a custom filter property, and then you set the filter to an expression. To clear the filter, you set it to an empty string. And which of these techniques you use is determined by where you got your data from. So let's go see how to do drag and drop data binding with data grids, and then we'll see how to group, sort, and filter. I have the drag and drop data binding demo sample application open. This has two windows, one that shows drag and drop data binding with a list view, and what we're going to look at here is drag and drop data binding with a data grid. So I'm going to open the data grid example window, which is currently empty, and then I'm going to drag and drop data onto it. So the first thing I need is a data source based on the data I'm going to add. So these data sources were used to create the list view. I need new data sources for the data grid example. So I'm going to add new data sources. So I click on this icon here on the left. This brings up the data source configuration wizard. I'm using link to SQL, so I'm going to base my data sources on objects. Then I expand drag and drop data binding demo down until I find my entities, and I want customer, order, and order detail. And I'll click finish, and those get added to the data sources window. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a little bit more screen real estate here. There we go. First thing I'm going to do is add customers. Now by default, Visual Studio will create a data grid when you drag and drop from the data sources window. You can create a list view or individual text boxes, but I'm going to stick with data grid. And I'm going to drag customer onto the window. And Visual Studio creates a data grid and automatically includes all of the columns in the customer class. Let's look at the XAML that Visual Studio added. Visual Studio created a collection view source called customer view source based on customer. So this contains a collection of customers. Then it created a grid, set the data context to that customer view source, and then inside that grid the data grid, auto generate columns is set equal to false, and Visual Studio automatically created a data bound column for every property in the customer object. If we go and look at the code, Visual Studio basically got a reference to the collection view source. Again, this collection view source is defined in the XAML, and this is the XAML instance of the view. And then all we do is we find that and get a reference to it. So customer view source in our code basically points to the collection view source. Now what we need to do is get some data and populate the collection view. I've got a snippet for this. WADCO2, and I just do a simple link to SQL query, bring down all the customers, and set the source property of the customer view source to this collection, which is the collection of customers. And at this point, I can run this application, select the data grid example, and here's the grid showing all of the customers and all of the information for the customers. And because this is coming from an object, Visual Studio alphabetizes the column names. A couple ways I can change that. I can do it in the XAML, so I can come down here and work with the XAML. But I can also do, let's go back to the design. That's where I want to be. Select the grid, either by clicking on it, or I can use the document outline, select the data grid, come into the properties window, click the ellipsis next to columns, and then I can work with the columns here. I can set the width, which defaults to size to header, and I can also reorder them here by moving columns up or down. So now I have customers. I want to see the orders for each customer, so I'm going to go back into the data sources window. The customer class has an orders property, and that orders property contains the orders for that customer. So I'm just going to drag orders onto here. I'm going to put it down here, make this a little taller, and then I want this to take up about half of the remaining space. Okay, what did Visual Studio do? It added, if we come up to the top here, another collection view source called Customer Orders View Source, and the binding path is orders. So specifically, this collection view source is bound to the orders property of the current customer. So the one-to-many relationship is automatically taken into account. Source, customer view source, binding path orders says bind this second collection view source to the orders for whatever customer has been selected. And then we created a second data grid with order information. And while we're at it, let's do a third one. Let's get the order details for each order. So again, coming back to I want you to be right there. Perfect. For each customer, there's a collection of orders, and for each of those orders, there's a collection of order details. So this order details here is the order details collection for each order in the collection of orders for that customer. So now when I drag this order details onto the window, this will show details for each order. And we can see that Visual Studio added a third collection view source called Customer Orders Order Details. It is bound to the order details property of each order, and each order is part of the orders collection for each customer. So we've got a one-to-many relationship here. And therefore, the only code we really need to write is the code to populate the customers. And then when we run this, we've got a one-to-many. So for each customer, I can see the orders, and for each order, I can see the order details. So the nice thing about using the collection view source is that the one-to-many relationship is handled automatically. You can create the collection view source by hand in XAML. I think it's easier to use drag and drop data binding. Okay, now that we have the collection view source, we can group, sort, and filter. Let's go back to the Data Grid demo project. And let's take a look at the grouping, sorting, filtering window. Which looks like this. We're going to display customers in this data grid, then we're going to be able to group and ungroup, sort by city or company, and then filter, and then revert back to where we were. And we'll also need to open up the code and take a look at that as we go on. Okay, let's run this. So let's look at the grouping, sorting, and filtering example. The window comes up. We have customers in the data grid grouped by country. And in the country header, we see the country and then the number of customers in that country. And these are collapsible regions, so I can collapse the individual countries or expand to see what's in there. So let's see how that was accomplished. We'll come into the XAML. We're using a collection view source called customers view source based on instances of customer. And then in the code, we're going to run this query, bring back all of the information from the customers ordered by country, then city. And then we're going to get a reference to this collection view source and set its source property to the results of this query. And that's why when this starts up, we have the customers in the data grid. And then to do the grouping, all we had to do is specify that in XAML. The collection view source has a group descriptions property, and within that we add a property group description, property name equals country, and these 3 lines of XAML tell the data grid to group the contents by country. And as long as we've ordered by country in the first place, then they can be grouped. If we didn't order by country, that would throw an exception. Now that doesn't get us the blue background, the number of customers in each country, and the ability to collapse and expand. We did that by creating a style. So let's go down here, and we created a group style for the data grid. It's a container style. The target type is group item. And then we used a control template for each group item, and we said use an expander. And the expander control is a header with a collapsible region. So the header is this blue piece here, and then the collapsible region are the actual companies in that country. And so we said for the expander, it should have a header, its background should be light blue, and you should display the item count and make that bold. Then you should also display the name, which is the thing you're grouping on. So it's the name of the country, and that should be bold. And then the content region of the expander should be whatever the data grid is displaying. So I just set that to items presenter. In other words, we're not doing anything specific, just use the individual data grid rows inside the expander region. That's how we get these collapsible and expandable group regions. So then to do grouping, sorting, and filtering in code, I need a reference to the view. So the last code that runs when the window loads is this line of code here. I want to get the view property of customer's view source cast it to a list collection view, and now customers view represents the underlying view. And now I can write some code that will enable me to group and ungroup and sort, etc. So the first thing I can do is ungroup these. If I click ungroup, I am still ordered by country and city, but I've turned off the grouping. And I did that here by referencing the group descriptions property of the view and clearing it. And then I set the country property as visibility to visible. Because when I'm grouping, I don't want to see the country in the grid. So notice that country appears now, but if I group, that column goes away. And if I ungroup, that column comes back. So the grid actually has a column here, the first column, whose visibility was set to hidden. When I ungroup, I set it to visible. If I want to group, then I'm going to clear the current sort, resort it by country, and then group by country and hide the first column. So I clear the sorts. I add a new instance of sort description specifying that I want to sort by country in ascending order. Add that to the sort descriptions property of the view. Then I add a new property group description based on country to the group descriptions. So actually this line of code here is the programmatic equivalent of this XAML, where I add a property group description based on country to the list of group descriptions. I can do it in XAML. Here I'm doing it in code. And then I'm hiding the first column. So again, if I group, I turn on the grouping, the group style's in effect because it's defined in the XAML, and the country column disappears. If I ungroup, then I add the country column back in, and here I can ungroup. I can also sort by city. I can sort by company. And I should be able to do that whether or not I'm grouping. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, if I sort by city, I clear out the sort descriptions property of the view, and then I add a new sort description based on city in ascending order. If I do company, then I clear the sort descriptions and I add a sort description based on company. And this, by the way, is why when I grouped, I cleared out the sort descriptions and then added a new one on country. Because let's say I've ungrouped and I've sorted by company. If I now grouped based on country, this would throw an exception because the list is not ordered by country. So when I group, the first thing I do is make sure it's ordered by country, and then I can group. I have the ability to filter, so I want to see just my gold customers or all customers. So here I'm going to use the filter property of the view, and I'm going to set it to a delegate. I'm passing the customer to the delegate. Comes in as an object, I cast it to customer, and then I just check for customer.orders.count. If it's greater than 10, this returns true. So that means when I click the button to filter on gold customers, I'm going to run that delegate for all 91 customers. So if I had a huge number of customers in here, there might be a bit of an impact. And then for each individual customer, if this expression, customerorders.count greater than 10 returns true, then they appear in the grid. Otherwise, they don't. So now I've filtered to see only the customers that have placed more than 10 orders. If I click all customers, then I clear that filter by just setting the filter property to null. And then the revert, I want to go back to the way I originally was. No filter, sorted by country, grouped by country, first column hidden. Now I want to explore a little bit more the idea of filtering because I ran into this when I was creating this demo, and I just want to share with you what I learned. There are two ways you can filter. One is by setting the filter property to a delegate. The other is by using the custom filter property, which just takes an expression. And you're going to use one or the other based on where your data comes from. So let's explore these. On this window I have 3 grids. The first one's populated using a dataset and a table adapter, and the second 2 are populated using LINQ to SQL. And the first one is going to use a view based on the binding list collection view. The second one, which uses a LINQ to SQL query, is going to try to do that as well. And the first 2 have their view based on the binding list collection view, and then the third grid has its view based on the list collection view. So when I click Filter on each of these 3, I want to just see the customers in the US. Okay, so let's look at the first grid. When I click Filter, to see the customers in the US, I don't have to set a filter delegate. I can just use a much simpler custom filter property. So here's my view, Customers View 1, which is based on a binding list collection view. And if your view is based on binding list collection view, then you can call the custom filter property. This filter is simply country equals USA. And when I set the custom filter, that applies in the grid. And if I want to see all of the customers, so clear the filter, all I need to do is set the custom filter to an empty string. Now when the window loads, I'm going to get my data set. I'm going to call the fill method of the customers table adapter, so fill the customers, and then my customers view source 1, which is my collection view source. Let's go look at the XAML. Customers view source 1, binding path is customers, and the source is the data set. So this says this view source is based on the customers table in the Northwind data set. And then my view, which starts out as an iCollection view, I cast to binding list collection view. So now customers view 1 is based on binding list collection view, and therefore I can use the custom filter. How do I know I can use the custom filter? Because it turns out, let's go into the immediate window, customers view 1 dot can custom filter. I can't evaluate that at runtime? Oh well. I thought I could do that in the expression window, but I'm showing it here. Anyway, can custom filter is set to true, can filter is set to false. So when I'm basing my view on a data set and using a binding list collection view, I can use the custom filter property, but I cannot use the filter property. So for this first example, where my view is based on the data set, I can set the custom filter property. I could not use a delegate. Okay, so now what I want to do here for the second grid is get my data from a LINQ to SQL query. And then I also want to use the binding list collection view because I think custom filter is easier. So, customers view source 2. I retrieve my data using LINQ to SQL, set the source property of the view, and then again, customers view source. The view starts off as an iCollection view. I'm going to bind it to binding list collection view. And then when I click filter, I'm going to try and filter. Now I have a clue here that this isn't going to work, because notice that the can filter property of my view is set to false, meaning I can't filter by setting a delegate, and the can custom filter property of my view is set to false, which means that I can't filter by setting a custom filter. So I would predict this doesn't work. But let's see. I click filter. First thing I'm going to try is to set custom filter by setting country equal USA. Step over this. Seems to have worked. I'll run. It didn't filter. Okay. So let's try the other route. Let's stop this for a second. Let's comment this out. Let's filter by setting a delegate. And then comment out the code to clear. And stick a breakpoint here. Now let's try this again. So now I'm going to filter by setting a delegate. And this throws an exception. The exception is specified method is not supported because I can't set a filter. So because I'm using LINQ to SQL, I can't use a view based on the binding list collection view. Otherwise, I can't filter. I discovered this the hard way. Thought I'd share that information with you. So if I'm using LINQ to SQL and I want to filter, then what I can do is base my view on a list collection view. So that's the third example here. Where is it? Here it is. Customers view source 3, the same LINQ query, only this time I take my view and I bind it to list collection view, and then I can set a filter, and the way I set a filter is by using the delegate. So the bottom line is if you're using a data set, you can use a binding list collection view and filter by using the somewhat easier to use CanCustomFilter. If you're not using a data set and you're using LINQ to SQL, then your view needs to be based on list collection view and you use the delegate. The data grid automatically supports data entry as long as the underlying data collection implements IEditable So if your data grid is based on a data table from a data set, then you can have data entry. If you're using a LINQ to SQL query, then you can have data entry. So as long as your underlying data collection implements IEditable data entry in the grid is automatically turned on. Now to edit, you can press F2 or you can simply click in a cell. To cancel the current cell, you press Escape. If you want to cancel all edits, you press Escape twice. If you want to add an item, you just click in the empty row at the bottom of the grid. If you want to delete an item, you press Delete. And then optionally, you could provide Add, Save, Undo, and Delete buttons and handle that in code. So you can rely on the data grid's built-in capabilities. You can also write code. The data grid has a number of properties you can use to control data entry. You can set isReadOnly to true, and then the users can't modify data anymore. You can control whether or not users can add new rows by using the CanUserAddRows property, and you can control whether or not they can delete rows by using the CanUserDeleteRows property. Now if you're using Add, Undo, Delete, and Save buttons, then you're already writing the code that's going to handle all of the data entry. But if you're relying on the built-in data entry capabilities, then you're going to need to trap for certain events. If you want to trap for edits to a particular cell, you can use cell edit ending and cell edit ended. So if you want to validate the contents of a particular cell, you can use cell edit ending. And if whatever the user entered is invalid, you could cancel that event. If you want to trap for edits to a particular row, you can use row edit ending and row edit ended. And again, you could use the row edit ending to do validation, and you could cancel that event if you don't want the edits to go through. All of these events occur when the edit is ending or has ended. You can trap for the edit beginning by using the beginning edit event. And I mentioned earlier that the user can delete an item in the data grid by pressing the delete key. But of course, you're going to want to prompt them to see if they really want to delete the item. Well, how do you trap for the user pressing the delete key? The data grid does not have a user pressed delete key event. How do you trap for it? Well, you can use the preview key down event. And that event gets fired when the user presses a key. You can check if that key was the delete key and then ask them, do you really want to delete this item? If they say yes, then you can have code to delete it. So let's go see how to do data entry using data grids. Here's the data entry example, and when this window loads, it will show categories in a data grid, and then we'll be able to edit, add, and delete categories. So let's run this. So the first thing I want to do is edit an existing category. I can click in a cell and get the insertion point. I can also highlight a cell and press F2. Either way, I can now start typing. So set this to cheeses and other stinky stuff. And so now I've saved that description locally. Not back to the database, of course, just locally. When I want to save it to the database, I need to call some code. So if I click Save, then my changes were saved. And the code that runs is actually pretty straightforward. And that is, I call the submit changes method of the data context. Okay, and we'll go back to this. If I want to add a category, all I have to do is click in the empty row, go into edit mode, and enter a new category. Pizza, deep dish, and other. And now I've saved that new category locally. You can tell it's local because it doesn't have an ID yet. But when I click Save and call Submit Changes, then it's sent back to the database, and the runtime retrieves the ID, and now I've added category number 9. If I want to delete this, then I can press the Delete key, and I want to prompt the user, do you want to delete this category? Well, how do I know that the user pressed the delete key? I know that because I'm handling the preview key down event on the data grid. So if we look in the XAML and look at the definition of the data grid, I'm handling preview key down. And the preview key down event will occur whenever I press a key. This E is an instance of system.windows.input.key event args. And so I can just check, is key equal to delete? And if it is, then I say, do you want to delete this category? And if I say yes, then the category is gone. After, of course, I save it back to the database. Now this preview key down event is going to occur whenever I press a key. So what happens if I come in here and start editing cheeses and other stinky stuff and I press delete, then my code thinks I pressed delete because I want to delete the category. So what I'm going to need to do is make a little modification in my code to distinguish between deleting characters or deleting actual categories. So what I need to do here, and I meant to do this prior, but never got around to it apparently. Let's add a Boolean called edit mode, and we'll just set it equal to false. Okay, so when I check for delete if the key is delete and also edit mode is equal false, then do you want to delete this category? Okay, so now run this. When I press delete, do you want to delete this category? No. And if I'm in edit mode, if I press delete, of course this doesn't work because when do I set edit mode on? Well, I want edit mode to be set on if I'm in the process of editing. So I'll go back to the grid and I'll use the beginning edit event. I'll use that to set edit mode to true, and then I'll use row edit ending to set it back. So when I begin an edit, edit mode is equal to true, and when I'm ending editing, edit mode is equal to false. Okay, so now let's run this. That should get us a little bit closer. Edit mode is currently false. I press delete. I get prompted do I want to delete this category? If I click in here, edit mode's on, and I can press the delete key to my heart's content until I'm done editing, then pressing the delete key goes back to deleting a category. And while we're in here, let's save the definition for cheeses. Let's save the description for dairy products back to cheeses. Okay, that's better. Now I can turn off the ability to edit information by making this grid read-only. So when I click read-only, what I'm going to do is set the isReadOnly property of the data grid to true. And that means that I can't edit data. So notice that I can't select anything. I press F2, I click twice, I can never select anything in the grid. So this is all now read-only. I'll turn that back on. I can control the ability to add new items. If I uncheck Can Add, then what I do is set the CanUserAddRows property to false. And now, I could add rows in code, of course, but I can't add them manually. I can also remove the ability to delete. And so when I press delete, I'm going to need to adjust for that, but I say, do you want to delete this category? Doesn't matter, I can't delete, so that's intercepted. But what I really should do, the last change I should make here, is when I press delete, is I should check for not only did I press delete, and not only am I not in edit mode, and not only am I at design time so I can run code, stop. Thank you. And also categories data grid dot can user delete rows is equal to true. Okay, so if I press the delete key and I'm not in edit mode and I'm allowed to delete in the first place, then prompt me, do I want to delete this category? So now I can delete, I get prompted, I can't delete, so now the delete key doesn't do anything unless I'm inside editing, and then it works. So that's the basics of doing data entry in a data grid.